V8 engines are nearly synonymous with American-made cars, and Chevrolet happens to be one of the few remaining American automobile powerhouses. Chevy has been using V8 engines in their cars and trucks since as early as 1917, although we didn't see the now famed small block engine until the 1950s. From now until then, Chevrolet has produced a ton of different V8 engines, some for cars, some for trucks, some for SUVs, some for supercars. You get the point, they've made a lot of different engines. With that in mind, it's time we take a deep dive into the world of Chevy V8 engines and figure out which ones are actually the best. Please keep in mind that the list that we are about to go into is not sorted in any particular order, and realistically there's probably anywhere from 15 to 30 engines that you could put on this list as far as just straight up Chevy V8 engines. So some of them got left out. The list had to be condensed down, so some engines are missing. And before we start the video, be sure to drop a comment down below. Let me know, what do you guys think is better, the GM LS or the Ford Coyote? We have that video coming up soon, so I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Drop them down there. And what a more fitting place to start out the entire list than all the way back in 1917. We had Woodrow Wilson in charge of running the entire US. We got involved in World War I, and Chevy introduced their new Series D cars. The Series came in two body styles, a 4-door 5-passenger sedan and a 2-door 4-passenger roadster. But we're not here to talk about the Series D car itself, but rather the engine under the hood, known as the Series D V8, which was a new engine developed by Chevy that was supposed to offer them a lot more performance, a lot more reliability, and just really thrust them into the lead as far as American powerhouse automobile companies. This was a small by today's standards 4.7 liter engine, and it was Chevy's first ever V8. Hell, it was one of the first overhead valve V8 engines. The design of this engine has a lot of weird stuff that we haven't seen in the modern age, including a partially exposed valve train, nickel-plated rocker covers, a gear-driven generator for the distributor, the starter in the valley of the block, and much more. Plain and simple, it was and is kind of a goofy engine, but that's to be expected for their first ever V8 engine. All in, this engine output an unbelievable, earth-shattering 36 horsepower at 2,700 RPM. Thank God for innovation, because a 36 horsepower Camaro sounds pretty terrible. Unfortunately though, this engine had a pretty short life from 1917 to 1918 as they stopped production of the Series D car and ultimately the engine, and we didn't see another V8 engine from them until 37 years later. Speaking of which, the 265 cubic inch first generation Chevy small block is the next engine on the list. Actually, let's just look at the first gen small block as a whole for this. Now obviously this includes a range of different engines, whether it's the 265 or the 283 that powered Chevy through the 1950s and the 1960s, or the 305 and 350 motors that dominated street performance in the 1980s. Regardless if you're a fan of small block engines or not, it's really hard to overstate their importance to not just Chevy, but for American cars as a whole. Plain and simple, the Chevy small block is undeniably one of the most important engines in all of automotive history, and especially for Chevy. It set the tone for what Chevy was about, what they wanted to do with their future, what their cars were capable of, and a lot more. And really, it laid the groundwork for everything to come after it. And while today's V8s are rather obviously a pretty big departure from the first generation small block, it's because of the small block engine that we have today's LS and LT engines. The small block was a revolution in terms of power, simplicity, ease of maintenance, reliability, parts interchangeability, and so much more. Dozens of first generation small block variants range from mild to wild, with horsepower approaching upwards of 400 in the early 1970s. As electronic fuel injection entered the picture in the 1980s, it became a common feature in performance models like the Camaro and Corvette, as well as the later TBI applications in trucks and vans. And while I'm not a big fan of TBI small block engines, again, it laid the groundwork for much better engines to be developed. All right, enough with the small blocks. Yes, they're interesting. Yes, they are very important to Chevy's history and all of automotive history, but they're kind of boring unless you look at very specific variants. So let's look at something a little bit bigger, a little bit hotter, and a little bit spicier. And that's the LS6. And no, we're not talking about the LS6, that's the hopped up version of the LS1 found in the C5Z06 and CTS-V, but rather the older 454 cubic inch LS6 that is arguably the absolute peak of all big block engines from GM. When the LS6 454 was first offered by Chevy in their 1970 catalog, it was intended to rule the streets by building on the same Mark IV design architecture that we saw with the 427 V8 that came before it. And by doing so, the LS6 454 maintained the 427's 4.25 inch bore, but it increased the stroke to 4 inches and was offered to the general public in 2 distinct versions. There was the more entry-level, entry-friendly 360 horsepower LS5 that you could find in full-size cars like the Capri and Chevy when equipped with the right packages. But we're not here to look at the entry-level engine. The bigger and the nastier LS6 could be optioned in the Chevy and the El Camino SS 454 cars with RPO code Z15/LS6. Although it certainly wasn't a cheap option, which is partially what makes it so rare. And you might be wondering, well then what separates the LS6 from the LS5? And it's actually a couple of different things. For one, the compression ratio was increased to 11.25 to 1, and its cast iron rectangular port heads featured 2.19-inch intake valves and 1.88-inch exhaust valves. It also featured a solid lifter camshaft versus the hydraulic lifters on the LS5 with a 0.520 lift and 316-degree duration. Combine all of that with the improved intake manifold, forged pistons, and ginormous 800 CFM carburetor, and you end up with an absolutely nasty combo making tons of power and even more torque to the tune of 450 horsepower and 500 pound-feet of torque. Although it is rumored that Chevy under-advertised the power that this engine was actually outputting in order to keep insurance companies happy and keep insurance premiums low for their buyers. I think it is worth noting that the Corvette could also be had with the 454 LS6, but not until 1971, and by then the EPA had come knocking, so the Corvette's engine had the power decreased to 425 horsepower, but it also got the addition of aluminum cylinder heads rather than iron, saving about 50 pounds of weight. As you probably know, GM then reused the name much later on. We had the LS6, which was found in the C5 Z06 as well as the CTSV, and it's more or less just a hopped up version of the LS1. As to why GM reuses their names all over the place, I genuinely have no idea, but the LS6 454 and the LS6, the modern one, share absolutely nothing in common other than the name and the fact that they were available for a relatively short time in very select applications. Now the next big block engine that we're going to look at is from nearly the exact same time frame as the LS6 454, and that's the ZL1 427. At this point, Chevy had a history of powerful engines that ruled stoplight racing and drag racing. These are engines like the L78, L88, L89, and so on. But the most brutal of them all, the nastiest, most powerful engine was the ZL1. This engine was born when a gentleman named Jim Hall began using all aluminum 427 cubic inch engines in his Chaparral Can-Am race cars, which saw great success and then caught the attention of Fred Gibb, who was a Chevy dealer in Kansas City, and Dick Harrell, who had previously worked with Gibb to build drag and street cars. At this time, Chevy had a central office program which allowed dealers to order cars that normally would not be available. So a mix of different options that normally would not be put together or available at all for that particular car. Then the dealer would submit that office to GM. It would go through their central office production order, also known as COPO, and then if it was approved, it would become a car. In 1968, Fred Gibb ordered 50 1968 L78 Novas under the COPO program with M40 automatic transmissions in place of the usual 4-speed gearbox. This was the first time Chevy had ever placed an auto trans behind a solid lifter engine for a production car, and by building 50 of these, the Nova was qualified to race with an automatic as per the NHRA rules. Fred Gibb then chose to apply the same strategy to the 1969 Camaro. He did this even while knowing Chevy was planning to release an all-aluminum version of the 427 L88 engine. The engine was designated ZL1 and had been planned for the Corvette. Compared to the L88, the ZL1 had a number of very important changes and parts that allowed it to make quite a bit more power and do so reliably. In the end, the ZL1 engine was rated at 430 horsepower and 450 pound-feet of torque, but later dyno testing of the factory ZL1 engines revealed its output was quite a bit more, in the 550 horsepower range. Between GM, Fred Gibb, and Dick Harrell, they developed the COPO package 9650, which placed the ZL1 engine in the 1969 Camaro to qualify for the 1969 NHRA season. With a massive 150-pound weight savings of the ZL1, it was sure to make the Camaro competitive against Mopar's Hemi for drag racing use. The 9560 COPO package started with an L78 equipped Camaro, but with the 427 ZL1 under the hood, plus 14x7 wheels, F41 heavy-duty suspension, a cold air induction cowled hood, a larger radiator, radio delete, front disc brakes, a 410 rear gear with a limited slip differential, and a lot more. Plain and simple, the 9560 COPO Camaros were designed for one thing and one thing only, and that was racing. They were very fast, and they were not very street friendly, and they were absolutely nasty. But unfortunately, when Fred Gibb ordered 50 of these 1969 Camaros with the COPO 9560 package, they didn't inform him of a new corporate policy. Now, before this new policy went into place, Chevy would absorb the extra costs of developing this new COPO package and putting everything together as R&D costs. But with a new corporate policy, all those costs were passed on to the dealer, who then ultimately had to pass it on to the customer. They didn't tell Fred Gibb about this, meaning he was expecting a $400 option on all these Camaros, so the base price of the Camaro plus $400 for the 9560 package, and it ended up being quite a bit more, to the tune of $4,160 of options, bringing the price of the 9560 Copo Camaros to $7,200. Very few dealers could finance that kind of inventory or even sell 50 Camaros that cost more than a $4,700 Corvette. And as such, Fred Gibb felt that Chevy had kind of screwed him over with the pricing that he wasn't expecting. So they negotiated a deal to send back 37 of the 9560 Copo Camaros, which were then distributed through Chevy's dealer network and sold. Those 50 cars plus 19 additional cars ordered by various dealers brought the total up to 69 1969 ZL1 Camaros produced. And to give you an idea of how fast those 1969 ZL1 Camaros were, they would run a roughly 13-second quarter mile at 110 miles per hour. Not only is that a decently fast car today, that is crazy fast by 1969 standards. Jumping forwards a bit, let's look at the LT5, and not the one under the hood of the C7 ZR1, but rather the one under the hood of the C4 ZR1. God, I really hate that Chevy just continues to use their same names over and over and over. It makes it way more complicated than it needs to be. Anyways, this engine is particularly interesting because of how it was developed between multiple companies. You have to remember that throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, all the way up to the 90s, GM was offering their small block and big block engines in various forms, but they were all very similar with the same cam and block design. Hell, Chevy is still using that format to this day, but we'll get to that later. When they were designing the ZR1 package for the C4 Corvette, they knew they were going to need something better. If this package was meant to be the pinnacle of Corvette performance and ultimately the pinnacle of Chevy performance, they couldn't just keep using an old dinosaur engine. So they teamed up with Lotus to develop something much better, or at least better on paper. I think it's worth noting here at this point in the video that in 1986, GM had acquired a 91% stake in Lotus after Toyota sold their stake to GM. So it's not like they were just going to a random British company. It's a company that happened to be in their portfolio of companies. When the Corvette division was developing the ZR1 package, they approached Lotus for help with the engine and the entire platform. With some help and some guidance from GM, Lotus went on to design a new engine that they then named the LT5. This new engine was a massive departure from the existing L98 V8 engine found in the standard C4 Corvette. It uses an aluminum cylinder block with the same center bores as the L98, but with dual overhead cams and 4 valves per cylinder. It also used a Lotus-designed air intake system that provided a surprisingly wide power band. Unlike the L98 though, the bore size was decreased from 4 inches down to 3.9 inches, and the stroke was increased from 3.48 inches to 3.66 inches. This engine also features aluminum cylinder liners, cast aluminum oil pump, hydraulic lifters, an 11:1 compression ratio, and a bunch more. Plain and simple, this was designed as an extremely high-performance, naturally aspirated engine, far past anything GM or Chevy was offering of the time. One of the parts that I find very interesting about this engine compared to any other engine from the 90s, or at least gas engines from the 90s, is that it holds a ridiculous 12 quarts of oil. For reference, the L98, which was the standard Corvette engine of the time, holds 5 quarts of oil. To keep everything cool, GM employed an improved cooling system with a larger radiator to keep the operating temperature similar to the L98 powered C4 Corvettes. All of this led up to a very impressive 375 horsepower, which sounds pretty bad compared to the performance-oriented engines we discussed earlier in the video. But you have to remember that the 1990s performance cars were severely restricted by the lovely folks at the EPA. For reference, a standard C4 Corvette was producing around 250 horsepower. So for the ZR1 to jump all the way up to 375 horsepower while still using the same 5.7 liters of displacement and not adding any sort of forced induction was a pretty big jump while still staying within EPA regulations. Strangely enough, this engine was pretty complicated. So complicated that Chevy didn't even feel comfortable building it in their own facilities that they had very many of. So they actually contracted out the work of assembling this engine to Mercury Marine. Supposedly, the engine assembly was about 95% drilling and boring completed at the Mercury Marine factory. And interestingly enough, the engine was almost entirely assembled by hand and then dyno tested before being sent to Chevy for them to plop into the ZR1 C4 Corvette. Later versions of the C4 ZR1 had their power bumped to 405 horsepower by modifications from Lotus in the form of cylinder head changes, exhaust system changes, and more. But it was all short-lived because in 1995, Chevy stopped offering the ZR1 after selling just about 7,000 units. Alright, the moment you've all been waiting for, when we finally jump up to the modern age with arguably GM's greatest creation ever, the LS. More specifically, we're putting the LS1 at this point in the video because, as the name implies, it's the first LS. It's the one that kicked off everything. Compared to the small block engines before it, and then the god-awful TBI engines, The LS1 was a far departure from it all, but it also was and is astonishingly similar to earlier engines, and at the time of its release had a lot of people wondering if Chevy had made a bad move by not moving to overhead cams as Ford had done in the 1990s. Regardless though, it is really hard to understate the importance of the LS1, which basically birthed the entire Gen 3 small block platform, which then turned into Vortec engines and so much more. The LS1 specifically was first debuted in the 1997 C5 Corvette. The brand new generation of Corvette came with the brand new engine. This is a 5.7 liter engine, and it features an all aluminum design. It also features coil near plug ignition and various other new engine management features. And as I mentioned, these new features made it vastly greater than the previous generation small block. And by 1998, the LS1 replaced the LT1 found in Camaros and Firebirds. When they moved from the old small block design to the new Gen 3 design, they massively beefed up the foundation of the engine by switching to a wide block design. This also then allowed them to use 6-bolt main caps, 4 bolts vertically and 2 bolts horizontally, which GM engineers named snap fit cross bolting. On the top end, Chevy took it even further by integrating the use of extra long head bolts that thread deep into the block to minimize cylinder bore distortion and variation in head bolt torque spec, as well as improving the clamping force on the block. Compared to the old small blocks, the camshaft was raised up and further away from the crankshaft, which then allowed them to clear a 4-inch stroke crank, which they didn't leverage initially, but later did to create the 7-liter displacement of the LS7, but more on that in a moment. To further increase the strength of the top end and ultimately the entire block, they started using a valley plate cover with the LS's, and as the name implies, this is literally just a metal cover that goes over the valley of the engine where the lifters reside and basically ties the top end, both sides, both banks of the block together on one piece. It also helps to eliminate the possibility of intake manifold leaks causing oil consumption. All in, the LS1 was a revolution for GM, but it was also just another generation of small block. And again, it was cause for concern off the bat since their main competitor, Ford, had switched to overhead cams in the 1990s. But as we all now know, the cam and block design was good enough for the modern age and still stands as a good engine today in 2023. Speaking of that 4-inch stroke capability, that's exactly how Chevy was able to develop the nastiest LS of them all, the 7-liter LS7. Functionally, it's very similar to just about any Gen 4 small block, which is also very similar to any Gen 3 small block. But it's not like Chevy just took a standard LS1 and just gave it a ton of displacement or something like that. Rather, it was developed as a truly special engine right off the bat. By using that massive 4-inch stroke, combined with the even larger 4.125-inch bore, thanks to the Preston steel cylinder liners, they were able to create that giant displacement. But with the application being a high-performance variant of the Corvette, they also needed to ensure the oiling system wouldn't become an issue, which is why they added dry sump oiling that helps ensure adequate oil pressure during high load cornering. Unlike other mass-produced LS, LQ, and LM engines, the LS7 was assembled by hand by a single builder at GM's Performance Build Center in Wixom, Michigan. This allowed them to pretty much follow all the best practices when it comes to low volume engine building and ensure the best quality possible for the Z06 Corvette. Other cool features of the LS7 include the doweled in place forged steel main bearing caps, forged steel crankshaft, precision deck plate honing, titanium connecting rods for reduced rotating assembly weight, higher flowing cylinder heads, an 11:1 compression ratio, and a unique intake manifold to match the improved heads, and so much more. All of this turned out an impressive 505 horsepower, and I know what you JDM guys are thinking out there. Hardy har, 500 horsepower out of a 7-liter, my 2-liter makes that. Listen, no one cares. The 7-liter makes 500 horsepower, makes a ton of torque, it's super reliable, it's literally designed as a track application, and it's designed to be able to do 100,000 plus miles. I'd really like to see your 2-liter making that much power do the same. And on top of that, that 505 horsepower is very, very easily bumped to over 600 horsepower with pretty much just a camshaft and nothing else. Honestly, we could keep going on and on and on about different LS engines and how they had profound impacts on the automotive market, as well as the aftermarket, from the LS9 and LSA to the LS3, and even Chevy Performance LSX engines. The point here is that the LS engine has dominated the world of drag racing, performance, road racing, drifting, and so much more. It's relatively affordable, very easy to swap around parts, very easy to get safe power out of naturally aspirated, it's incredibly compact for the displacement options, and much more. All right, enough of the LS, it's time we take a look at a much more modern engine, which is the LT, or the Gen 5 small block. Like the LS engine it was replacing, the LT featured an all aluminum design, coil near plug ignition, and loads of other similarities. That being said, the biggest and arguably the most important difference with the LT is the change to direct injection. The LT V8 engine family includes the LT1, LT2, LT4, LT5, L83, L86, L8T, and a few others. All of these engines feature the previously mentioned direct fuel injection system, variable valve timing, active fuel management, electronic throttle control, and other advanced features. I think it is briefly worth noting that all of those LT engines that I just mentioned are aluminum block, but the only one that is an iron block is the L8T. Cast in place cylinder liners result in an all aluminum deck face with induction liner heating utilized for dimensional control. This results in exact placing of every cylinder in every block. Nodular iron main caps retained with 6 cross bolts, just as the LS engine was, replaced previous main caps where powder metal was used. In addition to the redesigned main caps, every cylinder features oil spray piston cooling, where 8 oil spraying jets in the block drench the underside of each piston and the surrounding cylinder wall with an extra layer of oil to further reduce in-cylinder temperatures and improve lubrication. One of the major changes with the Gen 5 is that it features variable valve timing, and that comes in the form of a cam phaser on the front of the camshaft. And on the back of the camshaft, we actually have lobes to drive the direct injection fuel pump. This new variable valve timing system offers an enormous swing of over 60 degrees of authority over the camshaft position, which ultimately means a much wider power band, improved peak power band, and improved fuel efficiency. For the intake manifold, GM used an all-new design, allowing air to get into the combustion chamber much easier. More impressively, the imbalance of airflow is reduced to 50% compared to the outgoing small block. All in though, the LT is a lot like the LS that came before it. Gen 5 is very similar to Gen 4 and Gen 3, but the changes that they made are very important changes, and most notably, the variable valve timing, direct fuel injection really brought the overhead valve design, the cam and block design, up into the modern ages and allowed them to compete with overhead cam engines, at least in theory. And while I praise GM for pushing the limits of what is possible with a cam and block design, ultimately overhead cam engines are superior in just about every single way, which takes us to GM's newest performance engine, the LT6. And what makes this engine so special, so cool, so interesting, and such a big departure from anything GM has ever done is the fact that it doesn't have a cam and block design. Rather, it has dual overhead cams. And Chevy had huge aspirations for this engine. It wasn't just going to be a new type of engine or like a new family. This was going to be their best ever performance engine, plain and simple. Really, this engine started as the LT6R racing engine. In fact, the racing division worked closely with the small block production team to co-develop both engines, with both groups sharing data, ideas, issues, insights, and so on. What's even more interesting is that both engines share cylinder block, heads, valve train, and fuel system designs, meaning the LT6 is mostly a straight-up racing engine with minor changes for emission systems and reliability. But because the production LT6 isn't a racing engine, it's not held back by restrictions like the racing team is, meaning the LT6 makes even more power than the LT6R engine. How much power, you might be asking? Well, it's a lot. 670 horsepower at 8,400 RPM and 460 pound-feet of torque at 6,300 RPM. And right off the bat, you might be thinking, cool, the LT4 makes roughly that kind of power. Hellcats make a little bit more power than that. It's really not all that much power. But the thing you're missing is that this engine does not have any forced induction at all. It is making that 670 horsepower completely naturally aspirated. On top of that, it's not like it has a big displacement like the 7-liter LS7 or anything even close to that. It's a 5.5 liter engine. Getting that kind of power out of a 5.5 liter V8 without the use of race gas, ethanol, nitrous, turbocharger, supercharger, any kind of forced induction, anything like that is absolutely crazy doing that naturally aspirated. Starting with the two most important factors that allowed them to push out that kind of power. We have the insanely well-designed cylinder heads and flat plane crankshaft. Starting with the heads, we have a dual overhead cam design. The 2 cams per bank of the engine are then controlled by independent hydraulic camshaft phasing, with the intake side at 55 degrees of authority and the exhaust side at 27 degrees of authority. The even weirder part about these heads, there's no hydraulic lifters. You might be wondering why, and it's simply because hydro lifters simply don't like high RPM usage, and this engine is designed with that in mind specifically. Instead, it uses a mechanical system that uses robotically installed steel lash caps that requires zero maintenance. Of course, with the high RPM demands and high power demands, the cylinder heads need a lot of flow. Now, I think it's worth noting here that the LS7 heads were ridiculous at the time that they came out. They flowed a ton of air, they blew everything else out of the water, and it's part of what makes the LS7 such a cool engine. But the LT6 heads blow those out of the water completely. It is absolutely flat out ridiculous the amount of air that the LT6 heads flow straight out of the box with no modifications. On the bottom end of this engine is the other incredibly important part to the LT6, and that's the flat plane crankshaft. We've discussed this in other videos, but there are both benefits and drawbacks to this type of crankshaft compared to the standard crossplane crankshaft that we've seen in other GM V8 engines. One of the biggest benefits is weight, with the forged steel LT6 crankshaft coming in 33% lighter than the crank in the LT2, which is the standard C8 Corvette engine. With less weight comes the ability to rev the engine up and down much faster and also be able to survive high RPM conditions better. The downside to a flat plane crankshaft is that they vibrate a lot, which is exactly why Chevy ended up at 5.5 liters of displacement. They really didn't want to go any smaller because they wouldn't be able to make their target power, which was 650 horse or more. Obviously they passed that with 670 horse, but they couldn't go any bigger than 5.5 liters because of the ridiculous amount of vibration of the flat plane crank. The rest of the rotating assembly is also very lightweight, featuring titanium connecting rods and forged pistons, both of which are lighter than any other GM V8 engine. This further improves the ability to rev the engine up and down and also survive high RPM use. And the part that houses everything, the cylinder block, well, that has some interesting innovations as well. More specifically, the LT6 is a two-piece block consisting of the block casting along with the aluminum lower crankcase casting, also known as LCC. Both the block and LCC are partially machined, leak tested, flow tested, and then bolted together, finished machined, and serialized as a matching set. Once that happens, they are together forever. Just as with a race engine, the block is bored and honed using a deck plate. Combine all of that with the other innovations of the LT6, like the ridiculous dry sump oiling system, hot side, upside down injectors, active intake manifold, dual throttle bodies, ridiculously lightweight and high flowing exhaust system, as well as loads of other innovations, and you can start to see how the LT6 is without a doubt Chevy's best and most complicated V8 engine ever. And the proof is in the pudding. It is quite literally the most powerful naturally aspirated engine ever. And not only that, it makes 175 horsepower more than the standard LT2 while only weighing 1 kilogram more. For now though, that's that. We kind of just have to wait to see what Chevy conjures up for the ZR1 if they end up making it. And as time moves on, I'm sure we'll start to see Chevy introduced more twin turbo V8s into their lineup, or hybrid electric drivetrains, or whatever. From 1917 up until today in 2023, Chevy has made a lot of different engines and a lot of different V8 engines. Most of them are good, some of them are absolutely fantastic, some of them aren't so great, but for the most part, they have a lot of good V8 engines and there's a lot to look at here. But our time is up, so if you think I missed anything in this video, be sure to drop it down in the comments below. Let me know what else you want to see in the future. Get subscribed so you don't miss out on future videos. Smash the thumbs up button if you enjoyed this video. Check us out on Instagram and TikTok. We post a lot on there as well. And I'll see you guys in the next one.